Thomas Jefferson Hour listeners, this is Clay Jenkinson, sitting across here from my daughter, Catherine Jenkinson, and sitting near the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson. David, I think I took a whooping today.
I so love it when someone points out your errors.
So we were talking about this upcoming cultural tour that I'm leading to Cuba on the 8th through the 17th of February, so 2020. I can't wait, Catherine. It's going to be so much fun. And we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, and we're going to talk about Jefferson's grandson-in-law, Nicholas Trist, who was there in the 1830s, and we're going to talk about Ernest Hemingway, who fished and wrote a lot of his later life work at Havana and in Cuba, and we'll be going to a Hemingway site. But we did talk about the Battle of San Juan Hill, and the sense I got was that you're not entirely on board with the Roosevelt narrative of that.
No, not a bit, in fact. And although I am a great Roosevelt fan, of course.
Who would know?
Someone has to acknowledge his errors. We can't just be bowing down at the feet of Roosevelt every time we talk about him.
Certainly not. And summarize what you regard as his errors.
Well, I think it's pretty presumptuous for Roosevelt to think that we have to have wars so that we don't fall into complacency and so that we have these sorts of military exercises and experience, and that a great nation is a warring nation. Give me a break.
Can I chime in?
Please.
Yeah. What's your view?
Well, first off, I'm with Catherine.
Thank you.
To me, it's interesting because just listening and trying to be objective about it, there's been so many times in discussions on the Thomas Jefferson Hour when we have gone, well, yeah, but you can't really judge Jefferson like that because it was 200 years ago. And I think there's a little of that with Roosevelt. So while I would have to side with Catherine.
Well, let's maybe talk back to the little rascal. You know, all I hear from you is Hamilton, 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 Hamilton.
Wait a minute, who's the little rascal?
Yeah, her.
Yeah.
And you're a big fan of the musical. Well, he was a warmonger. He believed that war was glory. He believed that he had to prove something with his war.
Well, I'm no Hamilton fan. I'm a Hamilton musical fan.
Hamilton,
I do think we can judge Roosevelt and Jefferson differently, although, of course, Jefferson would never presume to say something as horrible as this. He said many horrible things, but about different subjects, of course. But the whole man theory doesn't completely apply here. We're talking about someone post-Civil War, post-Industrial Revolution, who is basically speaking in a way that he's speaking as if he's Caligula. You know, what are we talking about?
That's a little over the top.
Call Caligula the most corrupt of all this.
No, but I mean, what do you mean we have to go to war in order to be a strong nation?
I think you have to consider the mindset of people at that time.
Well, and I guess I should at least acknowledge that this is pre-World War I, and I think everyone's opinion about war, hopefully Roosevelt's opinion about war, would have changed post-World War I with the damage.
The carnage, the industrial carnage of that war.
I guess I'm just trying to say it was really a different mindset, and it was, as it was in Jefferson's time, still very much a man's world.
Well, here's what I love about the humanities, both of you. Whether we agree with Catherine's point of view or not, this is exactly the kind of discussion we need to be having. So, in other words, we all take for granted these stories of American history. And you can go to, say, the Medora Musical here in North Dakota and see a reenactment of San Juan Hill every night for 100 and some nights per summer. And we kind of accept this as part of the American narrative. And then when somebody steps back and says, well, what's really going on here? What does this signify? Why does Roosevelt believe that the effeminacy, as he calls it, of the American man has to be corrected by war? Where does that come from in terms of historical understandings of war? What does it say about Roosevelt the man?
If I can step in, may I?
Please.
Yes.
Before this turns into a whole separate podcast.
This is what's fun about the humanities.
I agree. But before we run out of time, Catherine, thank you so much for coming in and taking over.
Yeah, taking over.
Semi-permanent guest host.
Yeah, she wants the plaque.
Duties. If your father speaks like that again, would you give him one across the top of the head?
No problem.
slap her on the
I'm
little-
ready.
No, I'm
Don't worry.
trying to be serious and say how much I appreciate that you are
thank
here
you.
and how much I enjoy listening to the conversation between the two of you. You are just you're just great, and I want to wish you absolutely the best on your trip to Europe and your time studying there. So
Thank you so much, David.
with that,
it's always
I think
great
we
to
should
be
go
here.
to the show.
No, I agree. And call when you get work.
Okay, now you can smack him.
I love this show. I love this show. This is what I live for, to have these kind of conversations. And so thank you, everyone. Please contribute to the Jefferson Hour to the extent that you can. We love what we do. You know, having Catherine here is a pure delight. David, I know you'll be back. You've got your new plaque from our friend Christopher Baird.
Christopher Beach. Wow.
And, yeah. And I got no plaque, but that's fine.
See, that's why we need you, Catherine.
Yeah. Good day, citizens, and welcome to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, not in tights and wig today. I'm in street clothes, and I'm here to discuss with my daughter, Catherine Jenkinson, who happens to be here and is an occasional host for this program, a very special topic. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here.
You don't spend a lot of time in North Dakota these days. You lived here for about a year between degrees, but what brings you?
Well, I've come just for a few days before I leave to move to England, and I have to get my fill of a particular pretzel brand that you can only really get in North Dakota, and I find myself here to indulge before I go.
Catherine is referring to Dot's pretzels, which have swept the country, even the world. Dot is a North Dakotan from Velva. It's a little mustard powder and a secret other ingredients on a pretzel.
You try it. You try it.
But anyway, Dot has displaced Eric Severide, one of the greatest men who ever lived in America, as the most prominent person ever from Velva, North Dakota. You and I get into disputes about this. I'm anti-Dot. You're, of course, pro-Dot. And that's how parents and children operate. But you came all this way for a pretzel.
I did, and you know what? I'm proud of it.
Yeah, well, you won't get that in England. Or maybe you'll introduce Dot's pretzels to Great Britain. Why are you going to England?
I'm going to England to start a PhD at Oxford.
DPhil, as they say.
DPhil.
In history.
Yes, so I'll be back here to talk to Mr. Jefferson for many more years.
So Jefferson went to England once in 1786 to see John Adams, and they had a wonderful trip through the home counties of Britain. We won't go into that. But you'll be studying with the extraordinary Stephen Gunn.
Yes, I will, and I'm very much looking forward to it. But today I'm happy to be here to talk to you. And I've heard, of course, I heard through the grapevine, not directly from you, that you're going to Cuba in a few months?
You know, I do these cultural tours, Lewis and Clark. Everyone's heard of the Wendover Death March and all the great adventures canoeing and on the Missouri River and climbing around the Bitterroot Mountains. And they've heard of the Jefferson trips to Virginia. There's Jefferson in France coming up in just a couple of weeks. And then there's the Steinbeck trip in Monterey and the winter encampments at Lac Lodge. You've been to these. So all that. But I have the chance in February, I think it's February 7th, is it not?
The 8th, I think, through the 17th.
So the second week in February, to lead a group to Cuba. And I'm really excited about it, Catherine. I wish you could go. Of course, you'll be slaving away at your doctorate in Oxford.
Of course, but this seems interesting, yes, but why Cuba? You know, everything else, Jefferson's Virginia, these winter retreats. Why Cuba?
A couple of things. First of all, Cuba is fascinating. It's been sort of locked in time. And because the United States has regarded Cuba as a communist enclave right at our southern doors, 90 miles off of the coast of Florida, it's been an exotic off-limits place. And because of that, it's sort of got locked in time. Now things are opening. It's not completely open yet, but under the Obama administration, there was a softening of the sanctions and a retreat from the hard line on travel. And it is still now possible, although the Trump administration has backed up a little from some of that, it's still possible for educational groups to go on educational visas to Cuba. And I want to see it now before what happens to it, because we know at some point in the middle of the 21st century, the doors will fling open. And when they fling open, it'll be Applebee's and Chili's and Ford dealerships and Costco.
You say that like it's a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing, but it'll be a different thing.
Okay.
And and Cuba now is sort of this wonderful, like, you see like the little insect frozen in amber.
Sure.
It's that. It's like this. It's this moment of a previous era in the history of the Western Hemisphere. People who've been there say it's just an astonishing culture, beautiful island, great people. Their interest in 1950s and 60s cars is just extraordinary. And so I wanted to take a group there before it's too late, because there will be a time when it's just like Puerto Rico or Jamaica or the Bahamas or all the other, Aruba. I think you've been to Aruba.
No, I haven't.
Where did you go for that wedding?
I went to the Dominican Republic.
All right, so you've been down there, and kind of a Cancun resort culture will spring up. So that's the main reason, and this is the 8th through the 17th of February. We can only take 16 people because the educational visas limit the number, which is right.
Let's talk about that quickly, though, because when you say educational visa, so you can't just hop on a plane to Havana, can you?
You still can, but what's happening is that the Trump administrations, and not to talk anyway about the politics of this, have said we're going to pull back from the Obama opening of Cuba. And so what this really does is prohibit certain types of cruise ships. But the person who's going with me, Wayne Fairchild of the Lewis and Clark Trail Adventures, you know him well.
Of course.
He loves Cuba. He's been many times. And we talked about this on the most recent Wendover trip. And he said, now's the time. And I said, but speaking on behalf of our listeners, I said, but isn't it like you're not supposed to go anymore? And he said, no, that's not true at all. It's perfectly legal. You're not sneaking in through the back door. It's not like they don't stamp your passport or something. There are educational visas. It's perfectly legal. There is no downside. You're not going to be on a watch list. Nothing can go wrong. So, but they limit it to 16. So it is a fully legitimate cultural educational thing to do, and so but they limit the number. That's why we're only taking 16. So I want to assure people who maybe are interested in this that there is no way in which this is an illicit or a slightly dangerous thing to do. It's no different from flying to the Bahamas, except that you can't take a group of 50.
Fair enough, but so beyond your own curiosity and this place that's kind of frozen in a certain era, why else would you be interested in Cuba? It seems so far from Jefferson.
It has a Jefferson connection that I'll come back to, but there are several reasons, Catherine. One is Hemingway. And Hemingway is one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century. He had a very strong presence in Cuba. They preserve his ranch and one of his writing houses, again, locked in time, locks it into this kind of wonderful. It's as if he just left the room. And so you can go, if you want an experience of Hemingway, you can go to Key West and you can go to Idaho, where unfortunately he killed himself.
But
this is Hemingway. Preserved it in this kind of romantic Ernest Hemingway world that he had for a number of years in Havana.
Obviously, Hemingway is so known for his time in Cuba, but I am embarrassed to say I actually don't know what brought him to Cuba or why he was there or what compelled him to stay there for so long. Do you know the answer?
Fishing. He loved big sea fishing culture. He also loved the idea of Cuba because it's so romantic. It's like the crown jewels of the Caribbean, and it's this incredible island, and it's really big enough to support a variety and diversity of cultures, fabulous fishing, Havana Harbor, etc. He also liked being a rebel, so he spent a lot of time in Key West. He liked tropical culture. Like the Cuban women, like Cuban music, like Cuban street culture. But that's what he wanted to do, to write and to fish. And so he was there. And so that's one reason. And I'm not a Hemingway scholar per se, but I've read Hemingway. And I love Hemingway's, particularly the short stories, the Nick Adams stories. But For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Sun Also Rises, The Old Man and the Sea, which is a story that's essentially based on his Cuba life. There's a Ken Burns film coming on Hemingway, which
wonderful.
I can't wait to see, and maybe there's at least a slight chance that I'll be interviewed for it. But I'm by no means a Hemingway scholar, so this was a chance for me. I sort of, when I taught, I think I've told you this, when I taught university courses, I would always teach books that I had never read before, a couple of them per semester, because then, of course, you're going to read them if you have to. And so I did. That's the first time I read Moby Dick. The first time I read Don Quixote were to prepare for courses in which I was teaching them. And so this allows me to go back now in midlife to read Hemingway in with new eyes. And so there's that. That's one reason, but it's not the most important reason.
What's the most important reason?
Theodore Roosevelt. As you know, as a North Dakotan,
of course,
Roosevelt became Roosevelt here. He later said, I would never have been the president of the United States had it not been for my time in North Dakota. And as you know, every child is required to memorize that at birth because that's all we have in North Dakota. Lawrence Welk. We
have Dot's Pretzels.
You and I just went by Lawrence Welk's boyhood home the other day.
That's true.
And we had a long debate, actually, about does Lawrence Welk matter? And we both agreed that he does. So Roosevelt was shaped by the Badlands of North Dakota. He later said in his life that if you could only save one experience of all the experiences of your life and every other one would have to disappear, think about that for a minute. You get one memory. That's it. It's like the Men in Black thing. Zap, everything else goes. What would you keep? And he said, I would keep my time as an authentic cowboy and rancher in Dakota Territory. That's cool.
And what does that have to do with Cuba?
He was there when President McKinley and the Congress of the United States finally declared war against Spain in 1898. Roosevelt was serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigned his commission immediately against the better advice of his friend Henry Cabot Lodge, against the pleas of his wife, who was suffering from a very dangerous malady. Even the President of the United States, McKinley, called in Roosevelt twice and said, don't do this, stay in your desk. Henry Cabot Lodge said to Roosevelt, if you do this, if you do this silly thing, it's political suicide. And Roosevelt said, I'm going. And he later said, Catherine, you won't like him much for this. I don't either. He later said, I would have left my wife's deathbed to go to Cuba. So he goes down there.
But why? Why was he so militant to go?
He believed a couple of things. That's a great question, by the way. Number one, he believed that if you want to be a major political actor, a major political figure, and there is a war in your time, you must get yourself into it. How dare you send somebody else's children to war, if it comes to that?
That's admirable.
When you ducked it yourself. Sure. And that used to be sort of the American standard. But his view was, I'm going all the way. I might just be a governor. I might be a senator. I could maybe be the president of the United States. And here's this war. I'm at fighting age. I have to get myself into it because otherwise I'm humbug. That was the term of choice in that era. And of course, he's right. Today we send draft evaders and draft dodgers into the presidency. That wasn't true when I was a young man. But for Roosevelt, it was, this is patriotic duty if you have political aspirations. We need to take a break. We'll continue talking about this in a moment. But the question you're leaving us with for the moment is, why Theodore Roosevelt? And why did he insist on getting himself into the Spanish-American War? And what did that signify? So we'll pick that up after the break. You're listening to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, guest hosted by none other than Catherine, Missouri, Walker Jenkinson, off to Oxford tomorrow. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're talking about Cuba, and there is a Jefferson connection. I'm seated across from my extraordinary child, Catherine, Missouri, Walker Jenkinson. And Catherine, you are here, and tomorrow we get on a plane, and we are flying to London Heathrow.
Yes, it's going to be wonderful. Fingers crossed.
And in a couple of weeks, you will matriculate at Oxford University, where you'll do a DPhil in early modern history, a doctorate.
That's true. I'm very much looking forward to it, but I'm so excited to be here, and I'm just fascinated by our conversation. Before the break, we were talking about why Theodore Roosevelt would be so interested in leaving his cushy job to go fight in a war in Cuba.
And I think you were a little bit persuaded by his argument that if you want to be a great leader, you fight.
Put your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. The second reason was, and I think you know this, is that during the Civil War, his mother was a Confederate and his father was a Unionist. And his mother actually asked TR's father, Thee, not to fight in the war because her brothers were Confederate officers. And so Theodore Roosevelt Sr., Thee, reluctantly did not fight, and he paid proxies. You could pay a proxy to go fight in your place then for $300 a pop. And Theodore Roosevelt was ashamed of that. He was never ashamed of his father, but he was ashamed of that fact.
Well, and isn't it also true that during the Civil War, his mother was so sympathetic to the Confederacy that they were actually assembling first aid kits or care packages? I mean, come on.
She was surreptitiously sending across enemy lines illegally care
From
packages.
New York City.
Right.
Wow.
And so she was an unreconstructed Confederate. And some people say that she was the model for Gone with the Wind.
Oh my.
Who's the woman? Scarlett O'Hara.
Scarlett O'Hara.
That some people believe that she was at least one of the models because I don't want to get into details because they're racist, but she was essentially an unreconstructed Southern belle, and she had an African-American maid that was assigned to her in childhood, and they grew up together, and the maid did everything, laid out her clothes and drew her bath, and was inseparable. And Mitty is her name, Mitty Roosevelt, was one of those people who said that African Americans really actually preferred life in the world of slavery, that they were better off and happier. And
wow, how horrible!
Yeah, but that was a very strong Southern tradition.
Well, it's a strong Southern tradition, but not if you're living in New York City in the late 1800s, and in fact earlier during the Civil War. So let's just step back for a moment, if you don't mind. How did Theodore Roosevelt's mother come from the South to New York City, which even then was one of the most progressive cities in the world?
Yeah, never marry out of your zip code, child. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. went down to Roswell, Georgia to visit a friend. He was introduced to Martha Bullock, Mitty. He fell head over heels in love. Apparently she was very beautiful. She had great Southern charm. She was a raconteur, a great storyteller. She was spirited. She was kind of a flirtatious, had a great personality, a lot of spark and presence, and he just found her irresistible, so they fell in love. And then when they got married, he took her back to New York, where she was, a fish out of water. But when the war came, he was ardently pro-Lincoln, friends to Abraham Lincoln, wanted to vanquish the South, wanted to end slavery. But he's married to this woman who is as Confederate as it gets.
Well, I know you don't want to go there, but what did he say about Jefferson Davis?
He said he was a coward and that he was, anything we do short of hang him, and, that this is a traitor. And so Roosevelt wrote this just kind of casually. And then he didn't realize, this guy is also a Southerner with a very prickly sense of honor. And so he wrote Roosevelt this letter saying, I think I've heard that you do, I challenge you, must not. This my honor is at stake. And Roosevelt then didn't even reply. Because he thought, oh, come on, really? Jefferson Davis, you're really going there? So there's some tension. But here you said, what was her influence? She loved her brothers who were in the Confederate Navy. So Roosevelt became a big Navy guy. The Navy is right central to his way of seeing it. That probably came from stories he heard about them. He had a great sympathy for them as individuals, but not for them as Southerners, if that makes any sense. And his mother was a storyteller of the kind of Brer Rabbit tradition, so, bear with that. These Southern stories about plantation life and rural life, and I'm sure there's a pretty strong racist core to some of it. But it instilled in him this love of story, this love of romance, this love of adventure, love of storytelling. He was a brilliant storyteller, both in prose and in person. So there's that. I think it threw him even deeper into his father's orbit because he worshipped his father. He loved his mother, but he worshipped his father. And in fact, when he became president in September of 1901, the first night he was in the White House after Mrs. McKinley left, he had his sisters there and their husbands, and he said, I just so wish Father were here to be here. That this is the moment you want Father here.
Of course.
He didn't say, I wish Mother were here. So that was another reason. He wanted to atone for his father's use of proxies. And when he finished the war, when Roosevelt came back after Cuba, he said, now the family reputation is repaired. Now my sons and daughters will not feel that the Roosevelts had ducked their national service in a time of need.
Sure. And at the time of the Spanish-American War, did Roosevelt's brother also join?
No. Roosevelt's brother was a playboy. Too much drink, too many women, too much partying, too many late nights, and he was dead, by the way. But he had been this kind of glorious. Roosevelt worshipped his younger brother because Elliot was an athlete and he was handsome and he was the life of the party and everyone loved him and he was charismatic and he wasn't sick. Roosevelt had terrible childhood maladies, including asthma. And so he just loved his younger brother, who was everything he wished to be, but his younger brother had mental instability, a propensity to alcoholism, lots of women, lots of trouble. He died young. He was the father, by the way, of the famous Eleanor Roosevelt. So Eleanor is TR's niece. Her father was this really complicated and bad man. TR helped to kind of raise her a little bit. As you know, she had a really, really rough childhood. At any rate, Corinne, Roosevelt's sister, said that when Elliot died, TR wept like a baby because of what this represented, the loss. So anyway, that was another reason that he fought, was to repair the family honor. And the third reason he fought was he was deeply ambitious. This is a path. This is a path. So he got himself into Cuba, which John Hay called a splendid little war.
But when you say he got himself into Cuba, so Roosevelt enlists, or the equivalent.
Equivalent. He volunteer cavalry.
And how does he come to lead the Rough Riders? I mean, does it automatically he has this power because of his political placement, or? He
wanted to volunteer. He offered the U.S. government set up, partly thanks to his persuading, a certain number of volunteer infantry and volunteer cavalry. So imagine it, people like volunteers just champing at the bit. It's weird. It's like World War I, where the flower of Europe went off for the glory of war, and then it turned out to be the greatest slaughter and cataclysm in world history. But we'll be home by Christmas, they said in World War I. So Roosevelt got himself there partly because of this clout, and he formed this cavalry unit, and it was the first volunteer cavalry unit, but that soon became known as the Rough Riders. And they had cowboys from Dakota and Wyoming and Native Americans from around the Great Plains and Harvard yachtsmen and Yale tennis players and
oh, great,
peoples of the aristocracy and then low life. And Roosevelt loved it, and he said this is the most democratic and heterogeneous corps of harem-scarum Rough Riders that the world has ever seen, and so on. It's all like this self-mythology.
But how did he come to lead this group?
Well, then he was second. He was a smart guy, so he had a chance to lead it, but he said no. I don't have any background in this. So he served under Leonard Wood, who became a famous American soldier. Wood had been involved in the so-called Indian Wars. And so he was the colonel, and Roosevelt was the lieutenant. But Wood then was called higher up to do other things, and so suddenly Roosevelt is the commander, the colonel of his own Rough Riders troop. Here's what happened, Catherine. It's amazing. So he resigns against the better judgment of everybody. He goes to San Antonio to train the troops. Then they get to Tampa, which is the embarkation point, and they force themselves onto a ship. They actually kind of form a phalanx and move other people out of the way to get to a troop ship because he so wants to go. And then his only fear is, we're not going to get there in time. We're not going to get there in time. The war will be over. I mean, it's like, yeah. And then they get there, and then they force these battles, and then they're going up San Juan Hill. They don't have horses anymore because the horses had to stay behind. And Roosevelt's on a horse, and they're like the withering fire from smokeless Spanish rifles coming down the hill. He says they're being knocked down like nine pins. But Roosevelt's loving this. Like, we had more casualties than any other unit. This is great. And then he leads up the charge. It's probably much, much, much less impressive than the mythology. But he leads this charge up Kettle and then San Juan Hill. And suddenly he erupts into national prominence. And because he has his own newspapermen that are his favorable guys, and they're writing about this, they're exaggerating. Frederick Remington was there making illustrations of all of this. So it was sort of a gentleman's war in a certain kind of way for the officers. And so Roosevelt plays this up. He comes back and he writes this book called The Rough Riders, 1898. And one of his critics said, it's a great book, but the only problem is your title. It should have been called Alone in Cuba. The ego of Roosevelt. Of
course. Well, not just the ego, but the ambivalence that you're describing toward the sanctity of human life. I mean, what leads to this? What makes Roosevelt so kind of crass about what people are giving up to be a part of this war?
Yeah, so some people would disagree, of course, with all that you just said. You could get these are fighting words in some quarters. But here's what he thought. He thought that war is good for a country, that we need wars periodically to tone us up, that we get lazy and complacent and sloppy. He believed that's one thing. He believed that American manhood was becoming effeminate, to use a term we wouldn't use today, but men were too complacent. He said a real man has something of the wolf in him. Then he is a fighting man. and that this is who we were. This is how we came out of the savannas of Africa, and that we've become too civilized and too effeminate, and we need to tone us up with this. And so he had that theory. And he also believed that war is an instrument of state. That he said all great nations are warring nations, are fighting nations. So he had this theory, and he probably had these insecurities about his own manhood because he was a New Yorker, a blue stocking, a kind of a pampered aristocrat. And he also had been ill. He'd been this invalid. And so now he has something to prove, and he's also proving something to his father's ghost and something to the world. Anyway, all this comes together in a kind of perfect storm. In our time, it feels makes us a little squeamish.
Well, it makes us more than squeamish because we're talking about a man who comes from an enormous background of privilege. I mean, unimaginable. And to use Roosevelt's own words against him, it's not the critic who counts. Who cares if Roosevelt thinks that this is what nations should do? The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, the men charging up San Juan Hill. And of course, he was part of charging up San Juan Hill, but he wasn't one of the men who laid his life on the line so that Roosevelt could, quote, get his man.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Thomas Jefferson, did you just hear this? My child, sitting across from me here in the barn, in the middle of this learned conversation about Roosevelt's motives, jumps in and quotes Roosevelt's most famous speech. It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man. You quote this against me, against Roosevelt, and that's why a liberal education is a menace. Because here I was.
Send your children to college.
And they come back and they quote TR against you on the Thomas Jefferson Hour. You jumped in with the man in the arena and said, he's not in the arena. He's sending working class guys up that mountain, and he's taking all the credit for it. He's a man of great privilege. Why are we celebrating him? Well, he was the most conspicuous person. He's on a horse.
Well, we know for a fact that Roosevelt often staged photographs of him doing heroic actions. I'm not saying he didn't charge up San Juan Hill, but I'm saying...
Go to your room.
How nice it must have been to be on that horse.
You wouldn't get on that horse for $1 billion.
Of course I wouldn't. But I'm not waxing poetic about why we need war so we don't fall into complacency.
Nor am I neither, honey. All I'm saying is that journalists who were there said it's a miracle he wasn't struck down because he was so conspicuous. True. And he was recklessly heroic. And luck was on his side. I mean, he could have been killed that day. End of story. This crazy guy gets on a horse and goes up this impossible hill. He's shot down within 10 seconds. End of the Roosevelt saga. He survived. And then he wrote a book about it. And the book is a great book. It's sort of, you studied Latin. It's his version of Caesar's Gallic Wars, self-aggrandizing, but in the, that kind of a way. You're not buying it.
I'm not buying it, but I'll learn to accept it.
But you see the point that he is, you Renaissance scholars talk about Renaissance self-fashioning. He fashioned himself as this guy, the man of San Juan Hill. And it worked because for the rest of his life, Roosevelt was that person, the hero of San Juan Hill. When people didn't like him for some other reason, they said, yeah, but he's an authentic cowboy.
Get in line, honey.
Sure, you're going to question that, too. He was our first cowboy president. You can't take that from him. And he was an authentic war hero, if you allow that.
I'll accept it. I'm just saying, let's also acknowledge that not everyone was so lucky.
Do you know what he said later in life? He said that his only regret is that he did not receive a life-threatening and disfiguring wound.
I rest my case. All
right, so you're listening to this snarky father-daughter edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Catherine, so you asked why he went to war. I didn't realize there was going to be such a struggle. But those were reasons why he went to war. And it worked. He got lucky. He survived. He wrote about it brilliantly. He had favorable journalists. This propelled him into the governorship of New York. He was governor for 2 years. They wanted to kick him upstairs to get rid of him because he was an annoying nuisance and reformist. They make him vice president, thinking that's a cul-de-sac from which he'll never be heard again. September 6th, 1901, William McKinley, the president, is shot by an anarchist. Roosevelt becomes the youngest president in American history, including John Kennedy, still the youngest president, and served for 7 years and 171 days. Got any problem with that?
I have no problem with that. Did he ever return to Cuba? How often did he speak about Cuba?
Every day for the rest of his life. He never returned to Cuba, but he talked about it, of course. He called it my crowded hour. This was that moment when you realize this is the moment of my life. Here I am under this hill. I'm going to take it. I might get killed. I hope I get wounded. I've got these men if I make it, this is going to be like everything because it redeems the family honor and blah, blah, blah. I might be president. If I screw this up, but this is like the most concentrated moment of his life so far. And it worked. When we see it today, we think, in what sense was that really a war? A great country against a declining colonial empire, a reckless, self-aggrandizing guy, a guy who glories in blood.
Well, and let's just talk a little bit about the glory in blood and the kind of... Roosevelt almost seems to be this inspiration of something like The Most Dangerous Game or The Hunting of Humans. I don't mean to be too critical, but isn't it true? I mentioned this slightly earlier, but you didn't take the bait.
Yeah, because I'm a rational human being, but go ahead.
Roosevelt said, "I got my man."
Yeah, so he did kill a Spaniard, and he did revel in it a little, but just war theory. He thought that he was, remember the Maine went down in Havana Harbor, and the rallying cry of the war was "Remember the Maine," and several hundred Americans died. We now know that it probably wasn't a terrorist act, but their view was we're getting vindication here.
Oh, sure, and I'm not arguing that it wasn't justified or whatever Roosevelt did, that his actions were somehow wrong. I just mean the way he spoke about it later is as if to compare the killing of a man to him slaughtering an elephant in Africa.
Right. Well, let me just say this is your last appearance on the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're talking about do you not want to come on this trip now because Roosevelt is unique?
No. I'm just asking.
No, these are great questions, and you're right. This is the debate. We're going to take a break here, but I was while you were getting ready for the Jefferson Hour today, I was on the phone with a journalist, and he was asking, what should we do about the warmongering and the killing of animals and his attitude towards Native Americans and the Brownsville incident? Do we want to celebrate this man? Do we want to condemn him? Is it somewhere in between? Well, this is like I've drilled this into you from your earliest childhood, and you learned it much better at Columbia. But the purpose of history is not to judge. The purpose of history is to try to explore and understand. Let's take a break. We'll come back. There's more to say. We've only talked about 2 reasons for going to Cuba. There are more. You're listening to this special edition, somewhat cantankerous, may I say, of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, guest hosted by none other than my child, Catherine Missouri Walker Jenkinson, the only host who has ever quoted the Man in the Arena speech in this barn. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this special edition of the Catherine, what a delight to have you here. You educate them at enormous expense. They come back to haunt you and to challenge you. This is exactly what I want.
Thank you.
This is exactly what the purpose of liberal education is. This is precisely why we do it. Santorum said that you send them off to college, they come home hating America. That's not true. You send them off to college, and you hope that they learn to think for themselves, and that they have critical thinking skills, and that they challenge all received traditions, and that they open their minds to ask hard questions about things that we think are settled truths. And that's precisely what you're doing here. It's great.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here, and it's great to learn more about Cuba and Theodore Roosevelt, but at this point I'm sort of thinking, Marcia, let's get back to Jefferson.
Let's see, from the Man in the Arena to the Brady Bunch.
I take all knowledge to be part of my province.
I see that. I met, what was Brady's name?
Oh, Greg Brady.
I met him in the Reno airport, and I spoke to him on your behalf. So I'm at baggage claim. There's Greg. He's getting his golf clubs.
You spoke to Greg. Have you no shame?
On your behalf. So there he is, all alone at baggage claim, and I see him, and I thought,
here's a story.
I thought, do I go up to him or do I not? And I thought, I will, because you and I used to watch a lot of the Brady Bunch, including the movies. So I went up to him and I said, I don't want to interrupt. I just want you to know my daughter and I have had a lot of fun watching the Brady Bunch. And he looked at me like, don't make me call security. It was such a humiliation to be sneered at by Greg.
Did you feel like Peter?
No, I felt like, is it Jan?
Poor Jan. Justice for Jan.
Never caught a break. So here we are, straying a little. But so Cuba. So number 1 is Cuba before whatever happens to it happens to it. Number 2 is Hemingway. Number 3 is Roosevelt. Number 4 is the Cold War. We'll come back to that, but let's make sure we remain on the air. Number 5 is Jefferson. So Jefferson never went to Cuba, but he wanted Cuba. Do you know this? That he wrote a letter to Madison, and he said, I'm not an imperialist. I just want everything from the East Coast to the West Coast and from the North Pole to the bottommost tip of Cuba.
But how did he even know about Cuba?
Oh, everyone knew about it. I mean, Jefferson was a great geopolitical strategist. He read everything. He knew about it. And he then said, this will test your Latin. Catherine studied classics at Columbia University. She knows Latin and Greek. He said to Madison, but I'm no imperialist. He said, I want everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the North Pole to the bottommost peninsula of Cuba. And he said, and there we will put a cairn, and it will say on it, ne plus ultra.
Wow.
What does ne plus ultra mean?
Beyond which, nothing.
Thus far and no farther. Ne plus ultra.
Wow. Okay, well,
there's $250,000.
You're welcome. No, but why Cuba? Why not the Dominican Republic? Why not Mexico? I mean, what's he to heck Cuba or heck Cuba to he?
Wow, that's a pun from Hamlet. We're descending into madness. That was good. Reason not the need, says King Lear. Ladies and gentlemen, this is how nerd parents and nerd children live together, and it's so much fun, I can tell you. It was well known that Cuba was sort of the crown jewel of the Caribbean.
But why?
Because it's long and because it's in a place. Who controls Cuba controls the Caribbean. It's a gateway to the Caribbean. So in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's one thing. The other thing is it already was enough land to grow sugar, in gigantic quantities. So it's like a rich sugar island. Of course, that means slavery. Because there was no indigenous labor force there. And as Jefferson said, no white man in Virginia will do work if he can get someone else to do it for him. It's kind of sick, isn't it? Anyway, so Jefferson had this interest. And Jefferson's grandson-in-law, Nicholas Trist, who married Jefferson's granddaughter Virginia, was actually the American consul in Cuba in the 1830s after Jefferson's death. But he's there for 6 or 7 years as the American diplomatic consul in Havana from 1833 until the 1840s, and he took Virginia with him. And she has said, I was just with the Monticello group on the Lewis and Clark trip this summer, and Ann Lucas, who's one of their extraordinary scholars, told me that there are sketches that Virginia did of the streets of Havana that have never been published.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm going to try to get access to those to be able to talk about Nicholas Trist and Jefferson and his Cuban interests and so on. Well, anyway, then the final thing is the Cold War. So as you know, Robert Oppenheimer is one of my historical interests. Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb. The Cold War, 2 things happened, as you know, in April 17th of 1961, early in the Kennedy administration. An invasion plan to take Cuba back from the communists, back from Castro, had been hatched during the Eisenhower years by the CIA. Kennedy never thought it was a very good idea, but he didn't foreclose it because he was uncertain and new. And so he allowed the invasion plan to go forward. The idea was that expat Cubans trained in Honduras or Guatemala would come to the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba, and when they got there, this would ignite a Cuba-wide revolution. The people would rise up and overthrow the communist regime. It failed in every possible respect. Kennedy bears some responsibility for this because he didn't send in the air support. He kind of let it just fail. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, people like Curtis LeMay, the leading Air Force general in the country, were literally beating their fists on the table in the Oval Office, telling Kennedy he was a coward and that he was betraying this country by not invading Cuba. And this young guy, 45 years old, stands up to these the militarists who won World War II and says, I'm not doing it. And he was right. And he and Khrushchev probably saved the world, and it probably has something to do with the Bay of Pigs. So there's that whole thing. I'm fascinated by this. So we're actually going to the Bay of Pigs.
What can you do there? Do you just...
You invade, and then there's no air support.
No, but do you take a boat and
you take a coach, I think, there, and there's interpretation, and Cuba is really a much more open-minded place than you think, and you're free. You don't have handlers, as I did when I was in Yugoslavia, or you do in China. You're just allowed to move around, and we have special licenses to go to these places. So we'll go, and I'll talk a little bit about all of that. It's fascinating to me. I'll talk about Oppenheimer. I'll talk about the decision to use the atomic bomb and how close we came in 1962. And, of course, that has implications for our own North Dakota because after that, that's when they hothoused the ICBM missile project and put 300 nuclear-tipped missiles on the plains of North Dakota in reaction to ramp up after the Cuban Missile Crisis. You were, of course, not born then.
But why North Dakota? Did they just think, surely no one will ever be able to penetrate the borders of North Dakota?
Because they thought, if you blow the living daylights out of North Dakota, no one's killed and it doesn't matter. It's throwaway country. Have at it. And so they placed all these missiles in lightly populated places as close to the Canadian border as possible, because the missiles would go over the North Pole on their way to Moscow and Leningrad and so on. Anyway, so those reasons. Roosevelt, whom you've now trashed, Jefferson, who wanted Cuba, and ne plus ultra, using your Latin education, the Cold War, Bay of Pigs, and the actual Cuban Missile Crisis, seeing Cuba before whatever happens to it is going to happen to it, and of course, America's arguably greatest author of the 20th century, Ernest Hemingway. Who wouldn't want to come on this trip? You might even want to come on this trip. You could quote The Man in the Arena from on top of Kettle and San Juan Hills.
Well, now that you've said that Hemingway is the greatest author in the United States of the American.
Well, who would you say?
Steinbeck.
Faulkner.
F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Really? Oh, you love F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Who doesn't?
You would rank him higher than Hemingway.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I'd certainly rank Steinbeck higher than Hemingway.
Yeah, you might want to read Hemingway.
Wow. Crack a Steinbeck book.
This has been such fun. I don't think I've ever enjoyed being rebuked as much as I enjoy being rebuked by you. You were brilliant
Happy to
today.
help.
You were brilliant today, Catherine. Godspeed at Oxford. You're going to knock it dead. I hope you're as snotty to them as you are to all of us. David Swenson will be back next week. He's still suffering from some of the abuse he's taken on this program. Thank you. This was great.
Thank you, Dad. And now it's time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
At one point, the Democrats of every district in America had annual Jefferson-Jackson dinners. But today they've all but disappeared. Why? Because Jackson was the president who forced 15,000 Cherokee Indians to leave their homes on the eastern seaboard and walk to Indian country in Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears. Approximately 4,000 Cherokee died on that epic journey. The 20-some Democratic candidates for president in 2019 don't dare invoke the name of Jefferson in their speeches and interviews because he is now regarded as toxic. Even mentioning his greatness as an architect might deflate your campaign. I hosted a Theodore Roosevelt Public Humanities Symposium recently in western North Dakota. A few weeks ahead of time, a young woman wrote an op-ed piece wondering why we would gather together to celebrate a white nationalist. I don't really think the term white nationalist fits Theodore Roosevelt, but if you're looking for reasons to discredit him, it is easy enough to do. He said some hard-to-read things about American Indians, and he justified white imperialism in Kipling-esque terms, that the white Anglo-Saxon races of the world had a duty to bring light to the benighted indigenous peoples of New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and, of course, the American West. Oh, and he was a big-game hunter who sometimes seemed trigger-obsessed. Woodrow Wilson was a racist who opposed suffrage for women. JFK was a reckless womanizer who slept with an East German spy. LBJ waged ruthless war against a third world people who had never done the United States any harm. Besides, it was a civil war there in Vietnam that we could barely understand, much less sort out at the end of a B-52 bomber or the nozzle of a napalm gun. George Bush Sr. was knee-deep in the Iran-Contra affair, in which we traded weapons for American hostages held in Tehran. Bush Jr. was able to avoid Vietnam by using family influence to get a cushy stateside job in the Air National Guard, and he apparently didn't even show up for much of that. And then W. spent $3 or $4 trillion fighting a war against a people who did not bring down the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and who did not in the end have weapons of mass destruction. Bill Clinton, well, Hillary Clinton nailed it once when she said, and I quote, "Bill is a hard dog to keep on the porch." Ronald Reagan made racist remarks about these, quote, monkeys from Africa who are still getting used to wearing shoes. As Hamlet puts it, use every man after his desert, and who shall escape whipping? We become so profoundly enlightened in the last 2 decades and so fragile and brittle on this rarefied plateau of judgment, outrage, and righteousness that the whole past seems to be nothing more than a catalog of rape, corruption, imperialism, warmongery, racism, sexism, sexual exploitation, cowardice, and peculation. Now some candidates lose votes because they still eat meat. One of the news organizations recently asked the candidates to name their favorite foods, and in almost every circumstance, nervous campaign aides huddled for days trying to think of a food that the candidate could plausibly praise that was not going to alienate some important segment of the voting public. If you say you like milk, you just lost the vote of the lactose intolerant. And don't even think about admitting that gluten does not bother your digestive system. Think of the sorry fate of the candidate who would dare to say her favorite meal was cream chip beef on toast. End of the dream. It used to be that you could almost quote anyone in a stump speech, not Hitler, of course, or Charles Manson, but under the right circumstances you could quote Mussolini or Fidel Castro or the Apostle Paul. Today, every speech is scrutinized by the candidate's own staff to make sure nobody who is now seen as toxic is invoked. That doesn't leave much to quote. It's like going to a Unitarian church. You can be sure you will hear something said by Martin Luther King, but quoting almost anyone else might trip up some nearly invisible outrage alarm somewhere and make you spend the next 3 or 4 days first defending the quotation and then finally apologizing abjectly and saying you can hardly even bear to look at your image in the mirror, so great is your sorrow and self-disappointment. Aren't you all exhausted by this? I am. Weary, exhausted, frustrated, disillusioned, bewildered, and made cynical. I do think it is entirely appropriate to scrutinize the past with a new sensitivity to questions of race, gender, exploitation, and misogyny. But our mania to look back and discredit, sometimes for partisan reasons, more often to celebrate our own smug enlightenment, is, in my opinion, a very dangerous game. I'm not doubting that many or most of the allegations we make about dead men are true, but there are 3 problems in this righteous game. First, presentism. The enlightened of today assume that what we now regard as the highest cultural standards have always existed, and those scoundrels of the past knew about them and deliberately violated them. But this is not always so. 8 of the first 12 presidents were slaveholders. They were not cringing in their campaign headquarters, wondering when the New York Times would publish their slave rolls from their plantations. Most of the 12 knew that slavery was wrong, of course, but whether we like to hear it or not, slavery was not then regarded as sufficiently exploitative to disqualify Washington or Monroe or Madison from the presidency. Judging the past by today's standards is fundamentally problematic. The past was a very different place, operating with a different software, or as H.R. Hartley put it in 1953, the past is a foreign country. We think we can know the past, but in many respects its ways and means must remain a mystery to us, like the big hair of the 1980s or the appeal of the film Saturday Night Fever. And what makes us think we are so enlightened anyway? I'm wearing a shirt made in a sweatshop in China, and I drive a car that is helping to melt the polar ice cap. Second, please excuse the cliché, but we are throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Woodrow Wilson is not my favorite president. He was a serious racist who actually set back the placement of African Americans in U.S. government jobs. But is that all he was? Of course not. Wilson was a great idealist who believed that it might be possible for nations to rise above realpolitik and naked self-interest to get along peacefully in the world. He wanted to make the whole world safe for democracy, by which he meant the rule of law, due process, human rights, trial by jury, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and self-determination. He gave his life to those ideals. It crushed him when he discovered that most of the world, including apparently America, would rather wallow in war and misery and class division than commit itself to a more peaceful and enlightened path. And do you really think we can throw out Thomas Jefferson, the architect, the wine connoisseur, the master of library science, the author of the doctrine of the wall of separation between church and state, the paleontologist and meteorologist, because he was a slaveholder and arguably a racist? Don't we need Jefferson's vision of America more than we need to feel superior in lashing him and chiding him and race-shaming him and making ourselves feel more enlightened than America's Renaissance man? Third, we need a great national psychologist to try to explain to us why we are in this mood of outraged disillusionment with virtually everyone and everything that came before us. If you think that America's original sin was slavery, which it was, and that our national mission was a genocidal ethnic cleansing of the North American continent, which it partly was, that the history of the U.S. is the history of a self-dealing patriarchy that has done everything it can to hold women down in both senses of the term, and that our national achievement has been to wreck the planet, then you have lost your national confidence. This makes you vulnerable to attack from without, but also within. Abraham Lincoln wrote, "America will never be destroyed from outside If we lose our freedoms, it will be because we have destroyed ourselves from within. We all know that the lens you wear determines what you see. What happened to us, that we now see our great experiment through so dark and dreary a lens. Once we have decided that they were all shysters and hypocrites, racists, misogynists, imperialists, torturers, and destroyers of Mother Earth, and we, their heirs, living guilty lives on an occupied continent, what next? Where do you go from there? I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.